Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 20 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the New York Rangers, in which the Sharks have lost 2-1. And this is a pretty interesting game. Let's actually time travel back to the beginning of this season a few weeks ago. The San Jose Sharks started it off historically bad, a 0-5 record, and that 0-5 record was even worse somehow than it actually looked because of just how lifeless and terrible the San Jose Sharks looked through those first 5 games. If they had continued that play that they showed in those 5 games through an entire season, it's like not even unheard of that they would have managed to go 0-82. That's how awful they were in those first 5 games. But the turning point of the season was Game 6 against this very same New York Rangers team. The San Jose Sharks managed to finally get their first win of the season, and it came off of a very dominant third period performance and then the overtime victory after that from Erik Karlsson. And from that point on, the Sharks have actually looked pretty decent. They've gathered more wins, definitely, more wins than the 0 they had through the first 5 games. And even though that also did take into account a 5-game winless streak that they had at some point, even through those 5 losses, very, very different from the 5 losses that opened the season. For the first thing is that 3 of those losses were in the shootout, which are essentially just tosses that could go either way, and even certain losses against like the Tampa Bay Lightning were by a single goal in the last couple of minutes, or against the Detroit Red Wings it was just more bad goaltending and the Sharks actually looked pretty good, or the loss to the St. Louis Blues wasn't too bad either. So generally the Sharks have looked significantly better since that first Rangers game, and now suddenly here in Game 2 against the Rangers, it seems, I won't say that this is going to be some massive turning point because we don't know exactly what's going to happen after this game, but the Sharks kind of reverted back to what they were like in the first 5 games. Now, it wasn't as awful as it was back then, but this is probably the first time that the San Jose Sharks have really looked like just quite terrible over a full 60 minutes of play. The San Jose Sharks were just outskated and outplayed by the Rangers, and I also should mention that this wasn't necessarily a case where the Sharks were, doing their best, but the Rangers just looked significantly better. The Sharks looked completely off throughout most of this game. Even their top players like Hertl and Karlsson were just having giveaways after giveaways. The 6-on-5 play near the end of the game where Karlsson just immediately passed it to a Rangers player was just a small look at how really most of this game had gone. And if not for the heroics of the Sharks goaltending, which was an extremely sort of 180 turn from the previous game against the Detroit Red Wings, the Sharks would have lost this game by an even wider margin than just the single goal that actually ended up being rather close near the end of it. So in the first period, the Sharks were outplayed pretty heavily. The Rangers had a ton of great chances. There was this particular shift early on in the game with the Sharks' fourth line on the ice where the Rangers literally teed up Adam Fox for 3 separate one-timers that Reimer had to sort of corral and keep the puck out of the net, and that was just generally how that first period went. The Sharks were quite lucky to escape in a 0-0 tie. The second period was definitely slightly better for San Jose, at least at even strength. The Sharks did not look too bad and did get a couple of okay chances for themselves. There was an Erik Karlsson chance that had a decent chance of beating Shesterkin, but otherwise not much doing for San Jose, and the Rangers in particular on the power play definitely looked like they could get one past Reimer. I believe the Rangers hit like 2 posts within 5 seconds on the same power play. Very, very close to actually taking the lead, but in the end, after 40 minutes, the game was still tied at 0. And in the third period, unlike the first game between these two teams where the Sharks were the dominant team in the first period, it was quite the opposite. The Rangers were the dominant team. The Sharks couldn't really get anything going, and eventually, with about 6 minutes to go, the Rangers would get the first goal and really the only 5-on-5 goal of this game to take the lead 1-0. Eventually, like I said, the Sharks would pull the goalie, go on 6-on-5. They would immediately give the puck away, and while there were a lot of Sharks players who were trying to play goaltender, none were good enough in the end, as the Rangers would make it 2-0. But there was some interesting drama near the end of the game. Couture would actually get a goal for the San Jose Sharks to prevent getting shut out for the first time this season, to cut this lead in half, and with 16 seconds left, the Sharks while losing the faceoff, actually managed to quickly make their way into the zone off of a very nice slap pass from Erik Karlsson to Kevin Labanc at the offensive blue line, and the Sharks actually got a decent chance. So even though a game where the San Jose Sharks were quite thoroughly outplayed throughout, they almost managed to win thanks to some close to timely scoring, as well as some fantastic goaltending. So like I said, while this was a bad game for San Jose, it still doesn't come close to some of the awful games that the Sharks had through the first 5 opening games of the year. Moving on to the players to talk about, and it's not really that much of a surprise that when the first, 58 minutes of this game aren't going particularly well offensively for the San Jose Sharks, that the reason being is that the one line that essentially has the entire offense of the Sharks flowing through it isn't really rolling. And so for the first time in a while, the Meier, Hertl, and Labanc line were not the Sharks' best line, and in fact kind of looked quite off throughout most of the night. Meier and Hertl, I mean, you're allowed to have bad games, right? No player, even Connor McDavid, is going to be able to have 82 fantastic games here through an NHL regular season. It is a grind, and some games you're just not really up to your potential, up to your best to play, and that was definitely the case here for this top line, not really generating much, and when they were on the ice, were kind of giving up a lot to the Rangers. On the second line, Couture, Barabanov, and Nieto, not a terrible line, and it felt as though at times later on in the game, David Quinn seemed to be leaning on them slightly more than he was leaning on the first line. Maybe that was just something I noticed because of the fact that this second line seemed to play in the offensive zone more than that top line. But a player who I do want to mention more of briefly here is actually Logan Couture. Couture has had a bit of an awkward season thus far, especially early on in the year when he was constantly playing with wingers that definitely didn't belong on the second line. He had frequently players like Bonino and Cunnin and Gregor and all of these types of players who were just not really going to assist him well, and Couture himself was also not playing well at all earlier on, and yet he's managed to still rack up the points since then. And over these past few games, now with new line mates, Barabanov, who is definitely more of a second line player, and Nieto, who is not really a second line player but has been slightly serviceable at the very least over these past few games, Couture has definitely improved his game, and the points continue to come. He gets his 9th goal of the season here tonight in game 20, which actually puts him on pace for over 35 goals, which is extremely impressive, even if it might not actually end up being the case. But even if Couture just manages to put up something like 60 points, it would be a solid game for him when you consider the fact that most of the Sharks' offense, like I mentioned, flows through that first line, and Couture is kind of left with the scraps. On the third line here, I mentioned that the third line in the previous game against the Detroit Red Wings potentially played their best game as a unit then, and they were once again actually not too bad here tonight. A couple of decent looks, probably some of the better chances that the Sharks actually had offensively came from a couple of these players. Cunnin earlier on in the game had a great look. Even Bonino had a pretty decent look at a time. There was the issue with Nico Sturm near the end of the first period, not in terms of his own play, but when he got rammed into the boards by former San Jose Sharks Ryan Carpenter. The Carpenter ended up just being assessed a 2-minute minor penalty, which I know a lot of Sharks fans didn't agree with. I was kind of on the fence. I could see the reasoning for why a 2-minute penalty was only assessed, but 5 minutes definitely seemed like it could have happened. Sturm ended up going to the dressing room for the rest of the first period, but he ended up being fine in the end, so he was able to finish out the rest of the game, if I'm not mistaken. All ended up being fine in the world, and like I mentioned, the third line actually not too bad for the Sharks here tonight. Pretty decent look for themselves. On the other hand here, once again, the Sharks' fourth line is just completely lost, is just completely awful, and I'm not sure where the solution is here for the San Jose Sharks. Lindblom, Lorentz, and Svechnikov as a unit, they didn't get much ice time here tonight, and in the ice time that they did get, it's just been awful, and this is not a one-time thing. This has really been the case over these past few games, so I'm wondering if David Quinn is going to be willing to make some sort of lineup change. I mean, the Sharks don't really have a lot of good options up with the San Jose Sharks currently, the two main sort of extra forwards at this point are Gadjevich and Noah Gregor, and I doubt either of those players would necessarily give an interesting dimension to this fourth line. Maybe you toss in someone like Gadjevich over Svechnikov or Lindblom, and there's like at least a bit of physicality so that this fourth line isn't literally only known for being hemmed into their own zone, but that probably still won't actually solve that major issue. And so it just really comes down to the fact that the Sharks lineup is not particularly deep, and players like Sturm and players like Nieto, who might more excel on the fourth line. Nieto is pretty good on the fourth line. Sturm would be extremely good on the fourth line, have been forced to take higher up spots in the lineup because the Sharks just have a lot of sort of holes in this 12-man unit. On to the defensive side of things, the San Jose Sharks defensively was kind of up and down throughout this game, right? You could point to the fact that the Sharks only gave up a single 5-on-5 goal here tonight to say that, wow, the Sharks defense looked really, really solid. But they did give up a decent amount of chances. Karlsson, I will say, actually had a bit of an off game. So after his previous performance there of 4 points against the Detroit Red Wings, he did not look particularly good here tonight. And that first unit in general of Karlsson Magno was a bit off. The Vlasic Benning unit, which has become the sort of defensive unit for the San Jose Sharks that they put out when they need to prevent a goal, which is kind of something that I wasn't expecting to say at the start of the season. If you told me that Vlasic and Benning would be the Sharks shutdown unit and actually not be too bad, I would have called you crazy, and yet here we are. This unit actually looked pretty decent at even strength. Players like Zibanejad and Panarin weren't necessarily getting that many great chances for themselves, and it was more so the other lines, players like Hedel and Capo Caco, who were actually getting some of those opportunities for the Rangers, so a decent job for them for sure. And another player who I actually enjoyed his game tonight a bit, I actually liked Ferraro's effort here tonight. As I've mentioned in the past, his efforts this season have been relatively rocky, and while I'm not saying that his game was superb here tonight, the defensive sort of pinnacle of play, I will say I definitely liked what he was doing at times. And then finally, we have the goaltender James Reimer. It was just a completely night and day performance from his previous outing against the Detroit Red Wings just a couple of days ago. That one was like his worst game of the season, potentially one of his worst games as a San Jose Shark as a whole, even dating back, if we look back to the 2016 season when he was picked up at the deadline, where he was really good in those few games he played at the end of that regular season. That Red Wings game may very well have been his worst as a San Jose Shark ever, and so suddenly now we come into this game against the Rangers, and while it is still a loss, so technically at the end of the season it's going to be looked back on the same as that Red Wings game will be as well, this was definitely significantly improved for James Reimer. Really did his absolute best to try and get the San Jose Sharks the 2 points here tonight. If not for his heroic efforts, if he played like he did against the Red Wings a couple days ago, if even Capo Kakinen was in the net, it's very possible that the Sharks are trailing like 3-0, if not more so, by the end of that second period. So even though the Sharks did not get the 2 points, Reimer tried his absolute best. It just wasn't there. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, where they will take on the Ottawa Senators, a team that many were expecting to actually be very good after their multiple moves this past offseason to pick up players like Claude Giroux in free agency and all of that, but they've been quite bad. I believe they're below the San Jose Sharks in the standings, though they're maybe just very, very tight in it, so we'll see exactly what ends up happening. Class dismissed.